Now, if we think about an ecosystem and we're an ecologist and we want to study an ecosystem, we might have an ecosystem here, which is, just an enormous forest covering a huge area of land. How on earth do we study that? How do we possibly count all of the organisms and really analyze that ecosystem? We could never count every single organism in an entire forest. It would just be impossible. So there are different ways which we can study ecosystems. One great way to study ecosystems is to use something called a quadrat. So a quadrat is often a little square or rectangular, it can be circular patch, and we put that down in an ecosystem. So this is a grassy area, this is a marine ecosystem, and we count the number of organisms in that little quadrat, and then we extrapolate. So if our ecosystem is this big and we do a little quadrat this big, we extrapolate that data to average out or take a good estimate of the number of organisms in the entire ecosystem. We couldn't count them all, so we count a little area or a few little areas, a few little quadrats, and then extrapolate that data or expand that data out so we can get what we think would be for the entire population. Another really great way to study ecosystems is to use something called the capture and release method. So this is a bird which has been captured and tagged, and then it will be released back into the wild. So they'll capture some number of organisms, release them back into the wild, and then they'll do some point later in time, they'll do another random recapture. And then in the recapture, they'll count the number of organisms which are tagged, so which were captured the first time around, and that will give them a kind of percentage of numbers in the population. So if they tagged 10 organisms and then they go and release them all and catch another 10 and find that only one of them is tagged, then that means about 10% of the organisms were tagged, which would mean that in total there must be around about 100 organisms in that whole ecosystem. So that's a capture and release method of measuring an ecosystem, or measuring the number of organisms in an ecosystem, because you could never count all of the birds in an ecosystem. And the last way to measure an ecosystem is something called a transect. So this is basically a straight line through an ecosystem, and you walk along the transect measuring or observing, taking measurements as you go. And a transect is really useful in ecosystems where there's a great deal of change over a distance. So the marine foreshore, where it goes from kind of water through to rock pools, through to sand dunes, is a great example of an ecosystem where a transect can provide really interesting data when measuring the ecosystem. So we've got quadrats to measure ecosystems, capture and release, and transects, and they will all help ecologists collect data on ecosystems.